things have been really good. And so without further ado, I would like, of course, to thank Isabel Lucas, which is the heart of all this project, and is here to talk with Jeanine. So thank you both, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Wow. Hi, everyone.
Boa tarde. Good afternoon or good evening, I don't know exactly. But I would like to thank you, Rita, and to thank you, Jeanine, for being here in Lisbon with us in Flad. And first of all, before the conversation, I'd like to ask Jeanine to read part of her book, American Dirt, that in Portuguese have an edition called Terra Americana, just for us to have enter in the book and enter in the universe of Jeanine's writing. Okay.
Thank you. First, I just want to say thank you to everyone for coming this evening. I want to thank Carmen and all of my hosts here at FLAD. It has been such a warm welcome in Lisbon, and I don't only mean the weather. It has been really lovely. But I really enjoyed my time here so far, and I can't wait to come back already. So thank you. I'm going to read, if I can get these glasses on around this microphone. Okay, good. I'm going to read a little section from close to the end of the book. This is the moment where our travelers have arrived in the desert, and they are attempting the border crossing. And as they are in the middle of the desert, they experience a moment of where they are in danger of being discovered. So, okay. Beto is listing all the tallest people he can think of from El Dompe when El Chacal makes the low-pitched warning whistle. Marisol spots the problem at the same time and inadvertently cries out. She points across the valley to a ridge on the far side where a trail of fawn, powdery dust rises up through the foliage. El Chacal does his whistle once more, commanding everyone to drop, and it's instant the way they obey. They drop like they were shot, all 15 of them, right where they stand. Get into the shade if you can, he says. The light is vigorous here. To be in it is to be discovered. To be out of it is to be concealed. When the desert sunlight shines on any scrap of moving color, that color radiates like a beacon. Mami and Luca huddled together beneath the shade of a rock, pressed up beside a silk tassel tree. Catkins hang down from its branches in pale green curtains that drop their clinging flowers into Mami's hair. Tucked into this dark alcove and curled behind their backpacks, they're invisible from the ridge where that plume of dust is growing steadily across the hillside in a sputtering line. Around them, the other migrants squirm to find cover, flattening themselves into the parched grasses, twisting themselves into the spiky shadows of yucca fronds, folding themselves into the silhouette of a cypress tree. They all become perfectly motionless and silent. Even Beto is quiet, lying flat among the blonde stalks, his toes pointing up to the sky. When 3 minutes have passed, they finally hear the vague rumble of an engine slurring itself into the wind. After another full minute, the vehicle appears on a slope not far above them, on the next hill over. It's the distinct white and green Chevy Tahoe of the U.S. Border Patrol. El Chacal's face betrays nothing. Nobody move, he says quietly. He's well hidden between Marisol and Nicolas in the shade of a standing rock. Because he knows it might be some time before they can move again, he always makes sure to land in a comfortable position. He sits on his bottom with his knees up and trains his binoculars on the passenger seat of the Chevy Tahoe, where a Border Patrol agent trains his own military-grade binoculars back toward them. We are invisible, Lucas says to himself, and he closes his eyes. We are desert plants. We are rocks. He breathes deeply and slowly, taking care that his chest doesn't rise and fall with the cycle of his breath. That stillness is a kind of meditation all migrants must master. We are rocks. We are rocks. Somos piedras. Lucas' skin hardens into a stony shell. His arms become immovable, his legs permanently fixed in position. The cells of his backside and the bottoms of his feet amalgamate with the ground beneath him. He grows into the earth. No part of his body itches or twitches because his body is not a body anymore, but a slab of native stone. He's been stationary in this place for millennia. This silk tassel tree has grown up from his spine. The indigenous plants have flourished and died here around his ankles. The fox sparrows and meadowlarks have nested in his hair. The rains and winds and sun have beaten down across the rigid expanse of his shoulders, and Luca has never moved. We are rocks. At length, the Tahoe finishes its noisy, indiscreet voyage across the ridge and disappears over a low rim into the next seam of the valley beyond.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you.
They're all silent.
It's like every writer's dream that you're going to write something and then you can read it out loud and people are forced to listen to it. So
Forced.
I enjoyed that. Yeah.
So the piece that Jeanine's read is after a dramatic scene, the open scene of the book. You that already with the book know what I'm talking about. And from that moment on, we have Lydia and Lucas' life change dramatically. The middle-class life in touristic and violent Acapulco is left behind, and another unknown, fear-ridden one begins, in which the two are fugitives who must cross the border from Mexico into the United States and use the train shared by thousands of illegal migrant men and women. Unknown, the train is known as La Besta. La Besta?
La Bestia.
La Bestia. This is the beginning of a book that has been the subject of a great deal of controversy and has divided the critics. The conversation quickly moved from the book to become a conversation around a book about Mexican silenced migrants, written by a white American woman who gets to write, and the answer that always is put in the scene is, why is she writing this? Who is writing this? Who needs to write this book? Who has the right to write a book? I guess that question moved you from since this book has came out, or before the book has came out, because the book has announced as a great thing, a great challenge book. So this question that is parallel to the book, because we have the narrative, the plot of the book, and we have the narrative parallel of the book that is a narrative of culture cancel, of who has the right to tell some stories.
Yes.
Tell me, how did you pass through these 3 years after the launch of the book?
How long do we have? It was very shocking. I should say, I'd like to begin with this question: why did I write this book? So I should actually, just to backfill a little bit. When the book was finished, I spent 5 years writing it.
Yes.
I visited migrant shelters. I went to Mexico. I visited orphanages. I spoke with lots of migrants. I talked to everyone I could find who was an expert in this subject, because I wanted to give the book as much authenticity as I was capable of giving it. So I talked to lawyers who were doing the pro bono legal work of representing unaccompanied kids. I talked to humanitarian aid workers, people who are leaving water in the desert. I spoke with scholars and the nuns and the priests who are running the shelters. I volunteered at a desayunador. I spent as much energy as I could learning about the subject that I wanted to write about. And then I wrote the book. And when the book was finished, my agent sent it out to 26 publishers on a Friday afternoon. And on Saturday, we had our first yes from one of the publishers, so less than 24 hours. By that Tuesday, we had something like 22 yeses. Mm-hmm. This was my fourth book. Yes. I never even had two publishers fighting for the right to publish my book. By the time the book went to auction, there were 9 publishers left in the auction. So I had 9 different publishing houses bidding for the right to publish this book. No one was more surprised than this lady. I did not expect that. But it was really funny and a bit of a precursor of what was to come, that in the week before the auction, I had a series of meetings, editorial meetings, with all the different editors who intended to bid on the novel. And every one of them asked me the same question first. Why did you write this book?
So that's the question.
Well, my answer is like, why didn't everyone write this book, you know?
And why you, a white American?
Well, first of all, yes, I am a white American. I am also Puerto Rican.
Yes. Your grandmother was from Puerto Rico?
My grandmother was from Puerto Rico. My father spent part of his childhood in
and
Puerto Rico.
And you were born in Spain?
I was born in Spain. My father went to elementary school in Puerto Rico. This was not like a distant reach for me to get to my Latino identity. It was directly in my family. But it doesn't have to be, because that has nothing to do with my right or my skill or my voice in writing a novel. But I really just felt I was amazed at the time. So I started writing the book in 2013, midway through a Barack Obama presidency.
Yes.
Do you guys remember what Earth was like then? It was a very different, very different place.
And I'm sorry, I have a quotation of you here at the New York Times that you said, I'm terrified of striking the wrong chord. I don't know.
Yes.
Of being vulnerable, of uncovering shameful ignorance in my psyche. So it was in 2015, 5 years, 15.
So, yes.
5 years before the book came out.
That was a totally different subject. So just this, I wrote this essay in the New York Times in 2015. This essay was about my memoir.
Yes,
my memoir, the first book that I wrote came out in 2004. It is a horrific true story about a violent crime that my family
Rip in heaven.
endured, yes, when I was 16. 2 of my family members were murdered. My brother was the only surviving victim of that crime. Sometimes I cry when I talk about it, but we will all be okay. But in 2015, I wrote an essay in the New York Times about racial justice in the criminal justice system, addressing the fact that the demographics in my family's tragedy were complicated because my cousins, Julie and Robin, who were sisters, 19 and 20 years old, who were gang raped and thrown off a bridge into the Mississippi River, they were white-presenting girls whose background was Puerto Rican and Lebanese. and 3 out of the 4 murderers were black. It doesn't matter, because ultimately it was 4 bad guys who murdered 2 innocent young women. And my family was not invested in the question of race at the time. This happened in 1991. I was 16 years old. As I grew up and I reflected on the way that the media portrayed that crime, and I reflected on the way that people would respond to the crime in my private life when I would tell them about it. And often people would be like, were they black? Were the guys black? And I would be like, what the hell does that have to do with anything? But I saw it, and I recognized the toxicity of that. And ultimately, eventually, I also recognized the toxicity of the criminal justice system when it comes to race. And I came to understand that even though these 4 young men were guilty of raping and murdering my family, they were also not treated fairly in the criminal justice system because they were black. Whew. So in 2015, I had the bright idea to write an essay about that. And it was a terrifying essay. It was a really scary thing for me to contend with publicly. And it was the first time in my life that I ever said publicly, I'm white. It wasn't like a news flash, because I am white. But I didn't go around identifying as white. I had never identified in that way before, because it never came up. Mm-hmm. However, my entire life, whenever I was in a position where I was prepared to discuss my identity, I was clear about who I was. I am Irish and Puerto Rican. That is my background. I am very proud of being Irish and Puerto Rican. My family celebrates both traditions. We have lots of mixed up traditions that blend both cultures, as many people living in the United States and all over the world do. When you have a confluence of cultures, it's not simple. My identity is not simple. But when American Dirt came out, suddenly on Twitter, there was a half sentence pulled out of that essay that I wrote in 2015 that was then blasted across Twitter as evidence that I switched my identity, that I had always identified as white as far back as 2015. By the way, in the same essay, I talk about being Puerto Rican, but they didn't quote that part. I was only quoted
that part
as...
was ever silent in that period, your Puerto Rican roots.
I'm sorry?
Your Puerto Rican roots were silent at that discussion.
Well, not only was it silent, it was ridiculed. I was Latina falsa, and my God, in the year 2020, I never thought I would ever have to defend my ethnicity. I don't owe anyone an explanation about where my father grew up or what language I spoke as a child, because I wrote a novel. It's nobody's business, and it was incredibly painful. It's such a personal thing, identity, and I think it's a very fraught thing for people in the United States, especially people of Latino heritage. And I did not think in the year 2020 that I would have to say to someone at the New York Times, excuse me, but Latinos come in different colors. You can be black or white or brown and be Puerto Rican. And why are we talking about this? It was crazy. I still don't understand how we got to that moment, except to say that so much of what came out of my experience was bad faith assumptions about who I am and why I wrote the book. Mm-hmm. And there's nothing I can do about it. I know why I wrote the book.
Why did you write the
Well, I
book?
wrote the book because I felt like it was a subject that people were not paying enough attention to. All of my books have this one bright line in common. My books are all very different, beginning with A Rip in Heaven. Here
She has 3 novels and 1 book of memory.
Right, and they're all very different subject matter. But there's one thing they all have in common, and that is that I always endeavor to take the story away from the perpetrator of violence and give it to the people who endure that violence. I am always hoping to turn a narrative on its back and examine it from the complicated angle, the angle that I feel has been too long ignored. So when I wrote A Rip in Heaven, it was billed at that time as the first true crime that was written from a victim's point of view. I don't want to write about the perpetrators of violence. I don't care what makes those people tick. What I want to know is about the suffering of the people who endure that violence. And to be clear, I think that was a significant part of the problem that people had with the book, because we are very comfortable in our society as consumers of violence, whether we are talking about violence on the screen or in the pages of a book. We are very comfortable with it as long as we are looking from the distance of the gun barrel. But as soon as you ask people to contend with what it might feel like to be the person who suffers that violence, well, that is like off limits somehow. It makes people very uncomfortable. And I feel like that was a significant element of, because look, if you turn on Netflix right now, you will find 24 different iterations of stories about Mexico. They are all about narcotraficantes. No one cares. Everyone's like, well, yeah, that's how we tell those stories. But I dared...
Banalization of this. It's a banalization of the narco.
Yes, it's a glamorization of violence. That's what it is. That's how we, largely that is how we tell these stories. So you ask people to contend with the reality of how that might feel, and suddenly it's trauma porn. Suddenly it's like, it makes people uncomfortable. But I would argue that it's a very important exercise in fiction. Lest we forget, those are real human beings on the other side of that gun barrel. Those are real human beings who got murdered. So maybe true crime shouldn't be always focused on the perpetrators of the violence. Maybe we should ask more questions about the people who have been silenced because they were murdered, because they are gone.
Mm-hmm. The book sold till now 3 million copies in 37 languages. It's true. Is that true?
3.5 million.
3.5. Okay.
We're closing in on 4, but no, not to quibble. But yeah,
yes,
it's a lot of copies.
Past 3 years since the book came out in the beginning of the 2020, these 3 years have passed. How do you read today all the critics that have been made?
Oh, I don't read them.
You don't read it. No. How do you deal with that? How do you look at 2020 and how do you interpret all of that?
It will be with me forever. It has changed me in some fundamental ways, but also it has not changed me in some fundamental ways that I'm very proud are still intact. I am a person who still understands that my greatest strength lies in my vulnerability, that I'm able to sit at the front of a room full of people and like open myself, like open a vein and bleed and show you like the deepest pain. I can cry on stage. I can tell you the story of all my trauma, and I will survive it. That is who I am. So the notion that I was somehow unqualified to write about trauma is bullshit, pardon my French.
Trauma and violence is part of your life?
Absolutely. And that all of that has made me who I am. And, you know, and so I embrace my ability to continue being open about those things. but absolutely, it was very painful to endure those moments after the publication. There was a very prolonged period of deep self-reflection where I really interrogated myself about, whether I had done any of the things I was accused of doing. Mm-hmm. And I will just say, I'm pretty comfortable where I sit right now. I've come to the end of that interrogation, and I'm just fine.
And the conclusions are?
I'm just fine.
Okay, nice.
I'm going to write another book, and it will piss people off, and I will be fine.
Yes.
We're in a frightening moment culturally, where there's a tremendous amount of self-censorship happening in the arts, and specifically among fiction writers. And I am sure that I am in danger of self-censoring in moments as well. But in some ways, I feel like I am the most liberated writer in the United States today, because they already did their worst, and I'm still sitting here. So, maybe I can afford to be brave in ways that other writers can't right now. I think it's paramount that we all hold to the absolute liberty that writers must be free to write whatever story moves in their hearts. And if they do a bad job, fine. If they fail, okay. But they have the right to do it. And I think it's really, really important.
Yeah, you wrote, this novel is tremendously ambitious. It deals with political, economic, moral complexities connected with migration. When the novel came out, or even before the novel came out, you were very conscious about that it could be a very polemic and controversial novel.
Yes.
Because of all of this? Or something more?
I should say that I expected the pushback to come from a very different place. I thought it would come from the far right.
Okay, yeah.
And when it first sort of blew up, I'll never forget my editor on the phone saying to me, "The call is coming from inside the house," which was
what that told you about the book, the industry of books?
I don't know. It wasn't the industry of books.
No.
There's so much that I have learned over the last 3 years that took me a very, very long time to nail down. And I think primary among those things is that this polemic, the fury, was not coming from the people who purportedly it was coming from. I don't want to suggest that it was an illusion, because it was very much real. But it was a very, very tiny group of people. And something that was very upsetting to me was the notion that, the 2 or 3 Chicano writers who were quoted in the New York Times somehow constituted the Mexican response to the book. Mm. That was not a thing. I had tremendous support among Mexican writers. And a lot of people saying, why are they only quoting the ones who hate you? And I think the answer to that is that the media loves the controversy. So it was convenient to stir the pot rather than showing a balanced view that, this person really hated the book, but all of these people loved it, So, yeah, I think I'm very cautious when discussing the controversy to attribute it to Mexican writers, first of all, because that's a simplification that is not fair to Mexican writers, and is also not accurate. but it's also, I don't want to suggest that there weren't some Mexican writers who hated the book, because there were, like 3 of them. Literally, like 3 of them.
Very
Maybe.
quoted, yeah.
You know, there were a number of writers who signed a letter to Oprah Winfrey asking her to pull her support of the book. I think it was about 100 writers. And I really believe that group of people, that was the group of people. 100, or maybe 1,000. Let's be generous and say it was 1,000 angry people. Maybe it was 5,000. 3.5 million people bought the book. So I feel like weighting that 5,000 people is maybe giving an inordinate amount of power to a really small group of people who maybe don't warrant that kind of power.
Let's go talk about the book, American Dirt.
Should we do that? What a great idea.
So, American Dirt took us to a kind of play with that mythology about American Dream.
Yeah.
In which way?
Well, I was talking to someone before the event about the title.
I'm not original, so I'm sorry.
No, it's good. It's funny that Terra Americana in Spanish, and I will not attempt to pronounce it in Portuguese. You'll forgive me, but it has a different nuance, you know. Yes. And I don't know if there would have been a better. The thing that I loved about the title in the English edition was how many metaphors are attached to this idea of dirt.
Yes. Many writers have made in other books
yes.
that play. I'm
yes.
thinking about American Rush, Ferrugem, Rust.
Oh, yes, yes.
Philip Meyer.
Yes. I loved the idea that it could mean so many different things and that it was rather ambiguous. Mm-hmm. And it was funny because when the sales force in the United States were out shopping the book to retailers, there was a little pushback, not in the United States, but in the Canadian retailers and in some of the Caribbean retailers, like, please explain, why is it called American Dirt? American Dirt. So, you know, I love that question because it gave me the opportunity to say this, which is that the word American actually does not appear anywhere in the text, except when I'm referencing Central Americans and the American flag.
That's true, because I Googled it.
Yeah,
it's true.
There is one exception, and it is the moment when one of the characters arrives at the border, and she spits through the fence to leave a piece of herself there on American dirt. And that is the only line in the book where I use the word American as a modifier, as an adjective.
And related with that word.
Yes.
Dirt.
And I liked that moment because it felt to me like a nod to all the territorial ways that we've come to use that word, when in fact we are well aware, especially like as a Puerto Rican, I'm well aware that this is a word that is has been a little bit co-opted by the United Statesians, you know, and that when we say American, it should mean something much bigger than the United States. And in this context, it does. You know, so in my mind, the whole book takes place on American dirt. And I like the, you know, if you go to the border, I spent a lot of time in the borderlands when I was researching the book. And there's nowhere more surreal to be on the planet, well, maybe that I've been, than at the western end of the border fence in Parque de la Amistad, which is weirdly named because there's it is like the Friendship Park on the north and Parque de la Amistad on the south, and like a huge fence right in the middle. And it tapers into the ocean, which is so weird, you know? And the birds sit on top of the fence and like mock the Border Patrol agents, you know? And nature in that place just sort of conspires to illustrate the absurdity of this fence. Because it doesn't work. The waves wash back and forth between the slats of the fence, and the wind and the dirt whips through back and over across the border, and the animals go back and forth. And we are doing everything we can to militarize that space and to prevent humans from reaching the safety of the other side of that border. And, when I was there, I just remember observing that and thinking, like, how absurd that somehow the dirt on this side of the fence is different from that dirt over there. And you stick a pebble through, it's all the same dirt. So when we made the North American edition, we commissioned end papers for the inside covers of the book that were borderless maps, so that people could follow the journey that Lydia and Luca make, and Soledad and Rebecca, from their home places right to the United States. And we wanted them, I was adamant that I wanted the map to be borderless because I wanted to show just how clear it is geologically. It's one land, and the mountain range goes right across the border. And, it just seems like a pretty great illustration that we need to find better ways to contend with this terrible issue, immigration policy.
And how did you get to the characters of Lydia and Luca? How did you build it?
So it's funny. I wrote 2 completely failed drafts of this book, 2 whole books that I threw away. In case you're wondering why it takes 5 years to write to write a novel, I'm probably going to do that again. So the first 2 drafts were like both round robin point of view, 7 or 8 different narrators, very terrible. They were awful. And I was really trying to, and they were both actually set not in Mexico. They were set in the borderlands. And so I would write like 200 pages and I would send them to my writer friends. And invariably, they all said the same things. They were like, I hate everyone who's not Luca in this book. I resent them all. Every chapter that I'm with Luca, I'm happy, and then I'm pissed off when I'm with get rid of everybody else, go back to Luca. But Luca was at the border at that stage in those drafts. He had already arrived, and he was trying to get across.
So Luca is a child, 8 years old.
Mm-hmm. And he was, in those earlier drafts, he was an unaccompanied child. So there was no Lydia.
Okay. So Luca came first.
Luca came first. And so now comes the other story that I will tell, wherein it is possible that I will cry, but I will try not to. The moment that changed everything for me, both about the writing of this book and about my life, came the week before the 2016 presidential election, which you may recall was a real shit show in America. My father died at the table in a restaurant. He was 71 years old, and he was out to dinner with my mom and some friends, and he just died at the table. And we were, my grandparents lived to be 101, so we thought we had like decades to go with him, and it was a real shocking passing. We were very, very close. He was my biggest fan. And when he died, I was almost finished with the second draft of this book. And I was so angry at the book. I was like, what a waste of time that I could have spent eating ice cream with my dad. Like, I wasted, at this time, 3.5 years of my life writing a failing book. And then a week later, Trump was elected. It was a really bad week. And so I put the book away, and I just like hit the couch. I was in my robe for like 3 months. I was a really bad mom. I didn't even cook for my kids. I was like a mess. And then, and it's, you know, I've had a lot of trauma in my life. I am no stranger to grieving. But that was a whole new ballgame. Like, I could not function. And I'm going to just use this little napkin right here. It was a real eye-opener for me, because I always thought up to then that I was, like, good at grief. I was like, it's kind of my shtick. I know how to grieve. I'm an expert at trauma. I am not. I realized at that time that, like, it was my dad. He had been there every time I had a trauma. Now he wasn't. So I had to do it without him. Whew. And so I just didn't function for a while. I can usually get through it without this degree of, okay, I'm good now. Anyway, I put the book away, and then Trump was inaugurated, and it was just like went from bad to worse. And so in the depths of my despair, like it really, I was in a very dark place. And I came to a moment where I realized that maybe I could write my way out of it. You know, I had been steeping in these stories for 3.5 years. I had been doing this research. I knew a lot about the push factors that were causing people to leave their home places. I knew a lot about the real conditions on the ground that migrants were facing. I knew a lot of stories about people traveling on La Bestia. I knew the stories that I wanted to tell. And I knew the character of Luca. And so there's this strange thing that can happen, this sort of blessing in times of grief, I think, where you can be liberated, right? It can be like a springboard, because I had this brief moment in time where I just like did not give a shit what anyone was going to say about this book. I was like, well, nothing else matters now, so I may as well write the book my dad would be proud of. And I dragged my laptop into bed with me one day, and I wrote the opening chapter of American Dirt. And I didn't know at the time that I was starting over, that I was going to throw out that 275 pages that I had just written. But I think I knew as soon as those pages were down in front of me that this was the book I had been avoiding for 3.5 years, that it was the book my dad would be proud of, and that it was the book that I was, for better or for worse, it was the book that I was going to write. It was Luca's origin story. I never planned Lydia. She came to me fully formed in that shower stall in that day in my bed. A funny thing I was talking about earlier today was that in hindsight, it seems so obvious we writers are great therapists of everyone around us. We're great at psychoanalyzing all the people who are just passing by us on the street. I know your story. But not so great at recognizing in ourselves every single character in this book is grieving for their father. Everyone, like from Javier, Lydia, Luca, Rebecca, Soledad, all of them. And I didn't know that until the book was done. Mm-hmm. But the grief in the book was my grief. I was writing through my grief. It was happening in real time. Every time I had a bad day, I would give it to one of those characters. And so that was another extremely painful thing about the controversy, this idea that I was not qualified to write about grief and trauma. It was such a personal book.
Yeah.
My dad's fingerprints are all over it.
Do you have in your mind, when you wrote this book, any other book that was an inspiration in this matter?
So many.
Such as?
I think I read the entire catalog of Luis Alberto Urrea when I was writing. I read every...
You can read in Spanish?
I can, but I prefer to read book-length works in English because I'm slow. But I read a lot of... What I found that was incredibly helpful was a lot. There's a university in Tijuana. It is El Colegio de la Frontera Norte. And they have programs there specifically focused on the scholarship of migration in the Americas and trans-border identity. And what I found to be very, very helpful were a lot of writing, doctoral theses and students who were writing essays for that university, and I would find them online. And it really framed for me, because I did all that sort of academic research before I went to Mexico. I wanted to sort of lay the foundation. And so then when I felt like I had a good academic foundation, I went. And then it was the difference between sort of knowing something with your head and feeling it with your heart. When I met people who were making this journey, and it really just blew open so many new doors in me for how to sort of access the part of me that was able to write these stories. But it really, those works provided tremendous insight into, there's a little line in the epilogue where I talk about Rebecca and Soledad going to a high school in Maryland and sort of being expected to hang their backpack in their locker and clip their whatever into their 3-ring binder. And these are young women who have endured staggering trauma. And they are so much more mature. I have a 15-year-old at home. She could not ride a train with a first-class ticket by herself, and these girls cross a continent alone, clinging to the tops of freight trains. The insight that I gained in reading that kind of work was the vast difference between a teenager in the United States and a young adult in Central America. They are the same age.
I'm remembering in the beginning of the book, Lydia serves you also to talk about another subject of this book, that is the role of women in this migration crisis. Lydia, she can't go alone driving to Mexico City, for instance, in the beginning of the book because of the danger of violation and all of that stuff. I would like you to talk about this issue, the feminine question in the migration from this book.
Well, the last statistic that I saw was that among Central American women, 8 out of 10 are raped on the journey. They expect this. Many of them travel with Plan B, birth control, so that they can take medication after the inevitable rape. And they make this decision anyway because it is better for them than staying where they are. I feel like that tells you everything you need to know. It's horrifying, and it is the reality for so many Central American women. That word, cuerpo mático, it's real. That is the cost of getting to America. Your body as an ATM machine. And I don't even know how to interpret that. That kind of violation, of course, women in any society around the world, we have concerns that men will never have to contend with. But for women who are migrants, this is a terrible danger, and it is a terrible reality, even for very young girls. And, there was a lot of people have asked me about Rebecca and Soledad specifically. Mm-hmm. She's incredibly beautiful. And I write about this as being like a tremendous, it's like a terrible piece of bad luck. in her life. You know, that she's so beautiful and she does everything.
When you are a refugee.
Yes. You know, you do not want to be a refugee, and you most definitely do not want to be a beautiful female refugee. There is no more vulnerable person in the world. So that brings me back to our very first question. Why didn't everyone write this book?
Yeah. Another question that has to do with all the things that we are talking about, and you mentioned the research and mentioned all these political and social and cultural important questions, is the way you wrote the book, you choose to write the book. I guess it must be very difficult to be clear, to be literary, and not to be didactic, trying to pass some messages that's supposed to be moral thing and educational things.
Yes.
How do you balance?
Oh, I'm very bad at that. I always, I have a terrible, my first drafts are always terribly pedantic. Like I am like on my high horse and I am going to explain to you like what, you know, everything that's wrong. And then I am very fortunate to have wonderful writer friends who are like, please tone it down. It's really exhausting, your outrage. And it comes in revision. So, because, you know, it's funny, I know it's a very sort of unfashionable thing to confess as a writer. I always have an ulterior motive. All of my books, I am hoping to get people to think differently about a subject, always. And I know many writers, most literary writers would never admit to such a thing. They serve only the story. Good for them. I aspire to be that, you know, that lofty one day. But I always have an agenda. There's so much that I want to address in the world. There are so many wrongs that I feel like people aren't paying attention to.
That's a great declaration. I always have an agenda for a writer.
Well, like, you know, why not? If you're going to tell a great story anyway, why not also use the opportunity to hopefully change someone's mind about something that needs changing? You know, like, I don't see why that should be contradictory to writing a great novel or even a literary novel. Mm-hmm. And hopefully you can do also a commercial novel. What? All three? You know, that's my lane. Like, that's who I always want to be as a writer. And so I don't know. I guess it's unfashionable, but it's always going to be my way, I suspect. And so therefore I have to be very careful not to be a preacher. My dad was a preacher, by the way, so I came by it honestly, but I do need to tone it down because I always come into the story from that place. So then I have to find out how to weed it out and like maybe obscure it a little behind the service of hopefully just like a page-turning novel, you know.
I have lots of questions here to make you, but I guess all these readers have questions for you too. One more, it's what are the writers now that inspire you more?
So I'm currently rereading it. So I'm 2/3 or 3/4 of the way into writing my next novel, and I realized that my structure is collapsing. So I'm rereading a whole bunch of old novels that are great books, that have non-chronological structure, non-chronological stories, because I'm trying to remind myself that it's possible to do this. And so I'm reading Louise Erdrich's Love Medicine,
Yes,
which she's just
a great writer,
astonishing writer. You would follow her anywhere. But I think top of my list is always going to be Gabriel Garcia Marquez, because he's acrobatic. You would follow him anywhere as well. Like the magic of, he is the kind of writer who illustrates that there are no rules. There are no rules. And if there are rules, throw them away. Because he writes in such a way that the magic is in real life. So, you know, this magic realism it's real, and like you don't even question it. You always have this sense, well, of course there are like yellow butterflies following her around. Why wouldn't there be? It makes perfect sense. So I love that kind of writing where it's just so joyful that the reader will come no matter where you bring them. And I should say on that point as well, when I was doing all the research for American Dirt, it was one thing that I found so inspiring when I was in Mexico, when I was visiting migrant shelters, and I felt the heaviness of that journey, and I felt so much sorrow and suffering. And I was so astonished by the overwhelming preponderance of hope among people who had suffered so much. And they were not naive. They knew exactly what kind of welcome they could expect when they got to the United States. They were coming with their eyes open, and still they had hope. And, the sort of the kindness of people willing to put themselves in between vulnerable people and danger. That was just overwhelming. And it was a thing that I was so grateful for discovering in the writing of this book, because the story and the reality of the journey is so heavy that if it were not for the balance on the other side of so much kindness and so much hope, I don't think anybody would get through the book. I don't know if I could have gotten through the writing of it. But that light is undeniable on the migrant trail. So, yes, I thank God for that.
There's a sentence in chapter 9, I guess, which goes like this: fear and corruption. I don't know if you in the book is like that. Work in tandem to censor the people who might otherwise discover the clues that would do the justice. We are here talking for. This is a metaphor of many things, I guess.
Yeah.
Not only for these migrants, it's for us also, any of us. And now I pass the words for you. Questions to Jeanine.
Hi. You too. Oh, she's bringing you a microphone. Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you for the book and for sharing with us your experience today. Hi. Okay. Thank you for the book, and thank you for being with us today and sharing your experience. I want to know if we are going to see American Dirt in cinema.
Oh, I love that question. So we did sell the movie rights before, even before the book was published. And then after all the polemic, I thought, well, no one is going to touch that. But since I am among friends here, I can tell you guys a secret, right? It cannot be published in any newspaper, if there's anyone here, or online, please. But I have become very friendly with the Mexican filmmaker Guillermo Arriaga, and he's a big fan of the book. And the studio that bought the rights has recently approached him with an offer to both write and direct. So I'm doing everything I can to plead and beg and hope and pray that he will say yes, because I cannot imagine anyone else doing it justice as I know he would. I admire his work so much. And he just has bulletproof credibility. He is a wonderful filmmaker and writer, and I would be so honored if he were to make the movie. And if he decides not to, then I kind of hope no one does. I should not say that, but that is how I feel. Yeah.
More questions?
Speak out loud. What is your next book about?
Oh, my next book is, gosh, that's the worst question for a writer. I love it, but it's like, I've written, it's like you get to 110,000 words and then I have to tell you in like a cent. I'm like, it will take me 3 hours. But in a nutshell, it is about 3 generations of a Puerto Rican family, an Irish and Puerto Rican family, but also sort of how their identity shifts across the generations. And it is kind of about like how they become white, even though they're always white. But, it is about these questions of identity and the language of identity and how quickly it is changing from, for example, Generation X to millennials, and how we as Generation Xers are expected to be fluent in the language of identity, which did not exist when we were kids, and how we mess it up sometimes. And it's not because we're bigots, but it's because we're old. So, I mean, some of us are bigots, but, I just feel like there is room for a lot more real dialogue around these issues where we get into the nitty-gritty of, like, how these shifts happen and how even within a single family across the generations, there can be so much misunderstanding about who we are. Not only in my own experience, but over the last 3 years, I've talked to over 1,000 book clubs. I don't know how many book clubs. And so often, whenever I talk to Latino readers specifically, whenever I talk to Latina women who have read the book, every time it comes up in conversation, the word enough. I am not Mexican enough because I don't speak Spanish. I am not Puerto Rican enough because I don't know how to make mofongo. I am too Guatemalan because of the way I look or the way I talk. You're always letting someone down just by virtue of being in your body in the world. And I came to realize that, like, what happened to me was actually sort of like the most Puerto Rican thing that can happen to anyone, because this sense of being disappointing, no matter who you are, is really a problem. Like, so I feel like we just need to contend with this idea that identity is supposed to be simple. It's not. It's complicated. It's sticky. I'm never going to be able to check one form or one box on a form and succinctly describe who I am. There is never that box. That box does not exist. And if it did, I would be the only person in that box. So it's about that. It's about how we need to do a better job of having all of those conversations. And just, like, make room for each other to be sloppy. Like, we are who we are. It's cool. Let's just, like, keep it moving, So hopefully I can get all of that into a novel. See.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi.
Okay. Just 2 questions. First, do you think that all this issue of that we have been talking, and it's so strange because, in fact, just talking about these racial issues, etc., is something, for me, it's totally a strange thing, but it's something current. But do you think that all this controversy will give you some kind of advantage in the next book with the publishers and the public? Oof, or do you think
that would be nice?
will jeopardize your next book? And the second question, maybe it's something Portuguese, but I wonder, how can one afford to spend 5 years writing a book?
Yeah.
How can you live, or how can one live besides writing the book? What is it compatible with working somewhere? Do you have,
that is a great question. I love that question.
Or do you feed yourself?
So I'll go to the first one first. The question of my future is very much up in the air. I am really fortunate that I have tremendous support among my publishers all over the world, including here in Portugal, and I'm so grateful for that. I already have a contract for the next book in the United States, and I had that contract signed before the controversy. So I have a future that is at least one book long at this point. So it better be good. But, you know, the thing is that I am still incredibly controversial in the United States. And I can't do anything about that. You know, I am not going to get good support from mainstream media for my next book in the United States. So I'm lucky that I have 3.5 million readers around the world who like the book and will hopefully buy it anyway. And I have to believe that if I write a good book, eventually, look, it's not sustainable. This moment that we're in, this idea that writers have to stay in their lane and cannot write outside of their own life experiences means there's no fiction. So it has to change at some point. I just have to survive until we get to that point. So that is my current trajectory, just survive until we get out of this moment. Now, the question about how you survive 5 years, it's funny because I worked in publishing for 10 years before I became a full-time writer. And I was actually working at the publishing house Penguin when my first book came out. And then I had my first child. And I realized that I could not have 3 full-time jobs. I could not write books and be a mother and work at the publishing house, which entailed a lot of travel and was a very full-time gig. So I gave that job up in 2007. And it was really sad. I loved that job. I really loved the publishing industry. I grew up in the publishing industry. I loved being around book people. I didn't go to an Ivy League school, and I don't have an MFA, which most literary writers in the United States have those kind of advantages. I didn't have those. So I really got my education by working in publishing. And so leaving that behind was really scary. And I was sad to leave, but I knew that I wanted to keep writing books, and I already had the baby. I couldn't give her back, so I started running writing workshops and just doing everything I could to rustle up a little bit of extra cash now and again. My memoir has been course adopted into a lot of victimology programs at criminal justice colleges in the United States. So I do a lot of speaking at universities in support of that book. Sometimes those gigs pay. But I was really hustling for money until we sent this book to 26 editors on a Friday afternoon a few years ago. And, it's one of the things that I think people misunderstand about the way publishing works, because there's this word advance, and my advance was big news in the United States, so it was like what the publisher paid me.
7 digits,
Well,
they say.
I'd rather not discuss it, but it was a lot of money, especially for someone like me who was like bartending, trying to make ends meet, But when they hear that word advance, they think that means that somebody brought me this money and was like, here, go write a book about Mexico, which is crazy. That's not how it works. You write the book on your own dime. I spent 5 years teaching writing workshops and doing whatever I could to make ends meet. I am lucky to have a husband who also works very hard and was able to pay the bills largely during that time. But I had to fund my own travel, all of that research that I did. I was like scotch taping it together. And I was happy to do that. I felt so privileged to be living in a life where I was able to write books and not quite make a living, but almost. That reality was very much at odds with the perception of who I was when the book then came out. People had this sense of me as, I don't know, a socialite swanning about New York having lunch at the plaza, which was very much not my life. I was always stained. I always had like spit up on me, always. Not anymore, but yeah. Yes. She's coming with the mic.
Hi. Actually, I also have two questions. One is more about the process of writing the book. Did you structure it? How is your creative process? How do you deal with the book?
Okay.
I know you said you wrote 2 drafts that you
Yeah.
ditched and forgot and kept Luca only.
Yeah.
But while working on the final piece, did you structure it anyway? What's your process? And the other
Yeah.
question, which is, for me, it's, as a reader, I found way too many intense scenes on the book. And this is a great thing, because you don't find it in that many books and in so many books. So I was wondering, for you as a writer and also as a reader, what was the hardest scene for you to write?
Oh, it's easy.
The
Okay.
most difficult for
Yeah.
you to write?
Okay. My God, my brain is like Swiss cheese. What was the first question? It was like 10 seconds ago.
The process of writing.
The process. Out of my 4 complete books, I have only used an outline for A Rip in Heaven. But it kind of wrote itself because that was a true story. It already happened. So I just needed to, figure out which parts to tell. I used an outline for one of my other novels, and it was my least favorite novel. So I was like, well, I'm never doing that again. But then that's why it took me 5 years to write American Dirt. But once I wrote that opening scene, once I had that one day in my bed with my laptop, that epiphany moment where Lydia was in the shower in her shoes, it just came. From that day, it was right around the inauguration time, so January of 2017. A few weeks after I wrote that scene, I rented a casita in the desert in Arizona. I went to the borderlands alone for 10 days, and I wrote almost half the book in 10 days. I had been steeping in that research for 3.5 years, and I had such a backlog of those stories. And once I found my way in, it just came like thundering out of me in a way that has never happened before for me. But I think the shape of the book came very naturally. I did not plan it. I didn't think about it. It just evolved from there. And I also, there were moments like toward the end of my time in the desert when I knew that I was going to have to go back home and be a mother and start cooking and cleaning again, and that my time would shrink. I was writing for like 16 hours a day, and now I was going back to my life where I'd be lucky to get 3 hours a day. And I remember it was like the night before I was coming home, I was struggling with a chapter that I had written the day before, and I was like, something's not right, it's not working, whatever. So I went for a hike in the desert. I came back, I was all sweaty and dusty. I get in the shower, I lather up, I have like a head full of shampoo, and I figured it out. And I had to run out of the shower, dripping shampoo everywhere, and quickly typed up a couple of pages of notes on my laptop, and that was the end of the book. So then I got back in and rinsed off, and it was fine. But I had the 2 pages there that were basically the outline then for the rest of the book. I saw Soledad and Lorenzo at that cave. I saw what was going to happen. As far as the hardest scenes to write, there were 2. And I can't do can I do spoilers? No spoilers. So that makes this conversation a lot harder. I will just say that there was a scene that did not exist in the draft that went to auction. There is one character who doesn't make it, Can I say that? It's too late. I said it. I won't say who. But in the draft that went to auction, everybody makes it. And then my editor, she started sending me these threatening messages, like, so-and-so must die. Because she was like, look, if you want this to be a realistic representation of what goes on at the border, and you want it to change people's hearts and minds, we all know that statistically they're not all going to make it. And this is the one who has to go. So I was like, I need some time, but she kept at it, and I realized eventually that she was right, and so I had to write that scene right at the end, and it was brutal. I sobbed. I had been with that character for a long time, but she was right, and I think it served the story. The other really difficult scene was there's a moment where I had to research. There's so many awful things I had to research, but one of the awful things I had to research was what happens to a body in the desert. What happens when you die of exposure? Like what happens to the human body? Like what is that experience like? And it is impossible to learn that without having nightmares about it for months to come. And, every once in a while I still look at, there are maps of where in the borderlands are the most recent fatalities, and you can look at them online. The last time I looked, the horrifying statistic was that every 16 hours, a migrant was dying in the desert in the United States of America. And now I know what is happening to every one of those people. So that was a really awful scene to write. But, also I feel really important for people to understand, because if you actually know what goes on, and then you fall in love with a character who reminds you of someone from your real life, someone you love, and then you think of what might happen to that person, then maybe it blows open your mind to think about migrants or migration, hopefully in a different way.
Can you hear me? My question is about the last part of the book.
Oh, yes.
You have some people that are also doing the final part of the journey, but they do not come from Central America or South America. They come from the United States.
Yeah.
Did you also interview those people? Because
Yes.
I was really impressed about that.
Yes.
Because they are people that live in the United States for many years.
Yes. Something that really stunned me when I was doing my research in the border towns, Tecate and Tijuana. When I was there, I learned that the vast majority of migrants who were served in the shelters at that time were southbound. They were deportados. They weren't trying to get to the United States. They had been deported. Very often away from their families, away from their children. There was I attended a wedding at the border in Parque de la Amistad on the Tecate side of the wall, where the bride was a young Mexican woman who had been deported and had a lifetime ban because she made a felonious statement. It's called a felonious statement. An agent stopped her and asked if she was a citizen, and in a bad moment, she said yes. And that was a felonious statement, so she now has a lifetime ban. Her 3 sons are United States citizens. She's married to a United States Marine, and she cannot go to the United States. So they had their wedding at the border so that her family could attend through the fence. It's so crazy. It's so crazy. There's an organization I have started working with in recent years, United Marine Deported Veterans. We deport veterans who have fought in combat in Afghanistan and other wars. If they come back from combat, and as many combat veterans do, struggle with things like PTSD, addiction, domestic violence in the aftermath of being in combat, what we do for our American citizen veterans is we get them help. What we do for veterans who are not citizens is we send them to jail, and then after they do their time, we deport them. And this is not even uncommon. There is enough of them that they have a whole group, you know? So I learned a lot about just so many. There were people I met in Mexico who could not speak Spanish because they had been in the United States from the time they were 3 years old, and they've been deported back to Mexico. So now they find themselves in what is essentially a foreign country where they can't speak the language. They have no family, no support, and they're out on the streets. And I learned so many of these stories that even now, like it's been years since I was there doing that research. It is so outrageous to me. I still can hardly believe it. But I recognized immediately that I felt like that was an underserved part of the story, a part of the narrative that I feel like people aren't aware of it or talking about it. And so I wanted to make sure to include some of those characters who are really very much a part of the real story, very much a part of the reality. So I created those characters. They're not based on real people, but they had a lot in common with a lot of people that I met.
One more question.
Hello. Thank you very much
Yeah.
for coming, of course, and thank you very much, very, very much for your book, which is great.
Thank you.
Let me just go back a few moments ago when you talked about the 3.5 million buyers of the book, which is marvelous. But does that represent also a kind of extra pressure when you write?
Nah. Yes, it does. I think that's why it has been over 3 years since the book came out. And, you know, even if it had been like Unicorns and Roses, which it very much was not, the publication, I think I would have had difficulty figuring out where to go next because in fact, I'll just say that as one of the challenges that I'm having now, the reason that I'm struggling with my structure and I'm going back to read all these great books, is that my new novel does not as yet have that propulsive plot line. None of my other novels have had that. I don't know if I can recreate that, and maybe I shouldn't try. But I want it to be a page turner, you know? So I have to find ways to give it that real momentum, because if readers are going to come to the new book because of American Dirt, then they're going to want at least some of the same hallmarks of my writing, which are hopefully pretty sentences and characters that you love, but also momentum. And that is the part where I need some help. So yeah, I do feel a lot of pressure. It comes from a lot of different camps, a lot of different corners. But ultimately, if there's one thing I've learned over the last 3 years, it's that I'm going to be okay no matter what. Like, I'm going to write a book I believe in. I'm not going to publish it until I feel really good about it. And then hopefully a lot of people will love it, and inevitably a lot of people will hate it. And then I will go on vacation with my family. And I'll be okay, you know? So I just have to do it to the best of my ability and then keep it moving. That'll be it.
Thank you so much, Jeanine, for being here.
Thank you. It was really
Thank
lovely.
you to you all.
Thank you.
Jeanine is going to sign some books over there. And thank you.